Okay, so today we are going to look at Chinese architecture before the written record. The history before written record are available is called the prehistory. And the prehistory started in different parts of the world at a different time. For example, if we are talking about prehistory in Egypt, we are talking about 5,000 years ago, because the Egyptians had left us written record from as early as 3000 BCE. If we are talking about prehistory in Japanese culture, Japanese civilization, we are talking about something before the 6th century. So it's much later than ancient Egyptian. So the Japanese written record came to us only from the 6th century. Anything more than 1400 year old is considered as prehistoric. But when we talk about Chinese culture, prehistory means before, means about 3,500 years ago. It's about 1500 BCE. The oldest Chinese written record came to us from about the 15th to 13th century BCE, basically 35 to 3,300 years ago. Before that, it's considered prehistory. That is based on the modern kind of a scholarly standard, because we rely entirely on written record to define what is history, what is prehistory. However, if we believe the Chinese convention, if we also consider the believed kind of a legendary tradition, if you ask a traditional Chinese scholar when the kind of a reliable history started, they would tell you it is from about 2000 BCE, from the Shah Dynasty. So that dynasty was not confirmed by archaeology yet. However, ever since the time of Confucius, the Chinese believed there was a Shah Dynasty, and the Shah Dynasty was believed to be from about 2000 BCE to about 600 BCE, something like that. So the Shah Dynasty was not considered historic according to modern scholarship, but according to traditional Chinese scholarship, the Shah Dynasty was was considered a historic period. So, right there's some kind of a gray area. When we are talking about early history, there was a lot of debate, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of different theories and different understanding and a different periodization as well. So we're basically, excuse me. So we are going to look at today, I will leave the legendary Shah Dynasty to next lecture. And today we will basically look at what kind of a Chinese architecture we know before 2000 BCE during a period known as the Neolithic period. So that is basically what we are going to look at. Most of the works are from about 5000 BCE to about 2000 BCE from that time period. So now let's first take a look at the place we are going to focus on in this class. That is, of course, China, right here, right? Let's put Chinese civilization in the global perspective. First, geographically, China is located on the eastern side of the Old World, right? The Old World basically refer to the connected land of the three continents of Asia, Europe, and Africa. So these are called the Old World. They are all connected, and civilizations were in contact during, the past 5,000 years. It was a huge piece of land, but there was no untranspassable barrier to prevent migration from one side to the other. That's called the Old World. And then, of course, we know after the 15th century, there was the so-called discovery of the New World, and that is the Americas. It was by no means a discovery because the First Nations had been living there for tens of thousands of years before the arrival of Christopher Columbus. But the fact is, before the European Renaissance, the so-called New World and the so-called Old World were not communicating as frequently as, say, the civilizations within the so-called Old World. So that's the first understanding we should have. China is located on the east side of the Old World. And on the west side is Europe. And in the middle, we have the today, basically the Islamic world. The Arabic, the Persian, the Turks, etc. This area. So we have on the western part, we have Europe. On the eastern part, we have China. And also interestingly, the western end is a group of islands, the British Isles. And on the eastern end, we have the Japanese Isles, making it, looks very, very symmetrical. So China and Korea is kind of like the continental Europe, while we have the British Isles on the western end, the Japanese Isle on the eastern end. And then in the middle, we have the Islamic world. So that's kind of a geographically. In terms of timing, civilizations appeared at different time in the old world in different location. I mentioned that prehistory in Egypt means 5,000 years ago. So their civilization obviously appeared earlier. Their, written record appeared earlier than China, about 1,000 years earlier than China. Even earlier than Egypt is the area known as Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers. So there, you guys, most of you have taken architecture 1310. There is a piece of land known as the Fertile Crescent, referred to the area of Mesopotamia, and it goes to southern Anatolia, that is today's Turkey, and also past part of the Eastern Mediterranean and reaching the Nile Delta. So the Fertile Crescent refer to an area where the oldest architectural remains survived. Those are architecture from about 7,000 BCE, from 6,000 BCE. Those are older, and so it seems like that civilizations first appeared in the center of the old world and gradually spread to the western part, to Europe, and eastward to India, China. And we also know, if you believe in the single origin of the human race, you might have read that according to the mainstream theory, human being originated from Southern Africa and eventually, migrated to, spread to the Fertile Crescent. And then from there, civilization appeared, the idea of writing, about making wheels, the invention of bronze, etc. And from there, it spread to the entire old world. So that's, of course, one theory, but that should give you a sense of Chinese culture, Chinese architecture, Chinese civilization. It's not the oldest architectural system in the world. It didn't have the oldest written history, compared to Mesopotamia, compared to ancient Egypt. It was younger. However, Chinese architecture and Chinese civilization is unique because it is the civilization that extended almost unbroken from a Neolithic culture all the way to the 20th century. And ancient Egyptian civilization pretty much ended before the time of Christ. And so was the Mesopotamians. So they were older, but they didn't have a direct impact to the current world. The Chinese civilization, on the other hand, continued all the way to the modern world. And as a result, the Chinese writing today is still the only non-alphabetic writing in the world. It is a direct result of those ancient written system. So that should give you a sense of the the culture and its location in the global context in terms of its spatial location and its chronological position in terms of the civilization regarding the entire humanity. Chinese civilization is also a civilization of great rivers, right? Like the Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Indian civilization. These are all kind of a civilization of great rivers, and the river development played a big part in its history as well as in its architectural tradition. So these two rivers is the, yeah, you don't see it very well, but I can delineate. Okay, good, delineated. So this is the Yellow River in the north, kind of making some turn here. And go back a little. And this is the Yangtze River, kind of going this way. So these are two big rivers, one in the north, one in the south, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. And the little dot on this map shows some of the earliest architectural, archaeological sites. And they all concentrate, in the area of these two big rivers, especially its middle and lower reaches, the middle and lower Yellow River and the middle and lower Yangtze River. These are some of the oldest, the location where some of the oldest architectural record and archaeological sites had been discovered. So these are also the heartland of early Chinese civilization. The earliest dynasties of Xia, Shang, and Zhou, the three dynasties that we are going to cover in next lecture, are all in this area, in the middle and the lower Yellow River and the middle and the lower Yangtze River in the eastern part. So that's the those cultures we will look at in the first few lectures. In the Chinese language, in classical Chinese, architecture is called Tu Mu. And Tu means earth and Mu means wood. So basically, the classical Chinese term for architecture is earth and wood. So this name for architecture indicate the two most important architectural materials. It's very different from the Western tradition or Egyptian tradition or Greek, Roman tradition, because we know in the Egyptian and Greco-Roman architectures, stone is the most elegant and the kind of aristocratic architectural material. Those are the best. Stone was not a major architectural material for Chinese architecture for a long time. Especially during the early history, it was earth and wood. So the Chinese use earth to build walls, those rammed earth, and later the bricks and the tiles were invented. So those are basically burned earth. And even after the invention of bricks, rammed earth walls continued to be constructed, and bricks were only used to put a surface veneer to the rammed earth wall. So earth was a very important architectural material. And then wood, excuse me, in classical Chinese architecture was used to build the framework of a building. So earth and wood was the major architecture material, and the Chinese term for architecture is earth and wood, called Tu Mu. So from the earliest architectural record, we find these materials. For example, a cave from 15,000 BCE was discovered in the southern suburb of Beijing. And that cave was not entirely constructed by the human labor. So it's not quote unquote architecture yet. However, it provided the first home for early human beings for probably many thousand years. So it is a living space, and the human activity transformed this kind of natural cave into an architectural environment. If that is not a quote unquote architecture in the kind of rigid definition, then a residential site from 5000 BCE is definitely constructed by a human society, and that is from the Hemudu culture, and from Zhejiang province, just south of today's Shanghai. And that site was from about 5000 BCE. And there, a large areas of wooden architectural remains were recovered by archaeologists. And they discovered many different layers. And those layers belong to 5,000 BCE, 4,000 BCE, 3,000 BCE, etc., and etc. So it was a Neolithic site, and it was a village, if we wanted to call it, probably even a big city according to the Neolithic standard. So their houses were supported by wooden columns, wooden piles inserted into the ground, and they elevate the living surface above ground, and probably to avoid damp and humidity and dangerous animals like snakes and other dangerous animals on ground. And today, what survived there are those huge piles that used to support architecture. Wooden floors had, and beams fall to the ground, and some of them disappeared, but some of them remained. So this is a very early settlement. It is definitely architecture. It is constructed by early societies And that society is also a agricultural society, because there were also rice remains that had been discovered. So this is one of the earliest rice cultivating, farming settlement from 7,000 BP, 7,000 before present, to about 5,000 before present. That is from 5,000 BCE to about 3,000 BCE. And the wooden well you read in your reading is from the Hemudu culture. And here, the wooden members were combined without nail. This is before metal. So there wasn't nail at all. There wasn't metal, wasn't even metal. So the wooden members were combined with the mortise and the tenon joint. Basically, you have a hole in one piece of wood, and you have a tongue in another piece of wood, and they could be inserted into one another and create a joint. And according to the archaeologists, especially Professor Yang Hongxun, he believed that the remains analyzed in the article is a well, and the article gives you a very good sense about how that the significance of the well for early societies, and how archaeologists kind of reconstructed the well based on the archaeological remains. So these two earliest architectural examples also fit into the legendary kind of a tradition regarding human dwelling. According to the pre-Qin dynasty document, early human beings live in cave, and like the beasts, and they also live in nests like the birds. So these two examples, one is obviously a cave, another elevated on the tree trunk like piles, can be compared to a bird nest. So it seems like some of the legends were based on some historical reality. So there were nests like dwelling, and there were definitely caves that provided the first homes for early human being. So these two are from quite different location. Like the cave is from the Beijing area, from somewhere here. And Hemudu is here. So Hemudu belong to the south. It's south of the Yangtze River, and Beijing is north of the Yellow River. None of them are in the heartland of Chinese civilization before 2000. Before 2,000 years ago. So those areas are like on the border of heartland Chinese civilization. And, we find these kind of early residential remains. So even today, there are still Chinese people living in caves and living in elevated floors. But these are from even more remote area. So For example, in Yunnan province, there are still the stilt dwelling, the so-called stilt dwelling. And the living floors are elevated above ground from those piles. And in Shanxi province and in Henan province, in northwestern part of China, there are cave dwellings. And these cave dwellings are not natural cave anymore. These are, dug into the clay, the dirt, dug into the hillside. And these are human-created caves. So there are still kind of cave dwelling, and there are also stilt dwelling that could be considered as the distant echoes of those remote prehistoric architectural examples. So the previous two examples, the Zhoukou cave in Beijing and the Hemudu house in Zhejiang province, belong to two different ages. The cave belonged to the so-called Paleolithic, and the Hemudu belonged to the Neolithic age. Again, the threshold between Paleolithic and the Neolithic ages are different in time in different part of the world. So in China, from the transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic is from about 7,000 BCE to 5,000 BCE. The threshold would be earlier in the Fertile Crescent. But in China, basically, when we are talking about the Neolithic age, we are talking about 9,000 years ago, something like that. So before that, the human being used this kind of so-called old stone tool. Those are created by striking one piece of stone with another, create some sharp point, and these rather crude material. Those are known as the old stone tool or Paleolithic tools. And the Neolithic tools are created by grinding one piece of stone on the other to create smoother surfaces and cleaner edges, sharper points. So that belong to the Neolithic age. The Neolithic age also coincide with the domestication of plant and animal. The agricultural revolution also happened at the threshold of Paleolithic to Neolithic age. So the following architectural examples are like the Hemudu culture. Those are all from the so-called Neolithic age, all right? So we are going to look at these from the New Stone Age. There are many different cultures from the Neolithic age in China. There are, for example, the Yangshao culture, which are basically located in the middle Yellow River area. And there is also the Majiayao culture, which is further to the west in North China. And then there's the Dawenkou culture, which is in the lower Yellow River area. And the Longshan culture it also in the lower Yellow River areas, slightly more to the east, and also later in time compared to the Dawenkou culture. And then there is the Hemudu culture in lower Yangtze River area, slightly earlier. And then there is a Liangzhu culture in the same area, but slightly later. And then there is a Hongshan culture in the northeast, that is in today's Manchuria. So these are all Neolithic cultures. They have very different cultural products, and they also have different architectural traditions. We'll look at a few of them. We will focus more on these four cultures, the Yangshao culture, the Longshan culture, the Hongshan culture, and the Liangzhu culture. Yangshao culture is from this area, and from about 5,000 BCE to about 3,000 BCE. And Longshan culture is also Yellow River from this area. It is slightly younger than Yangshao culture, from roughly 4,000 BCE to 2,000 BCE. And then the Hongshan culture is from Manchuria, from the northeastern part, from that area. And the Liangzhu culture is from here. So Liangzhu and Hemudu, they are almost kind of a successive cultures. They're not named after the village in the same location, different location, but they are close enough to make us believe maybe the Liangzhu culture was a successor of the Hongshan, of the Hemudu culture. The Hemudu culture, we looked at the dwelling and also the well you read about. So Liangzhu culture is slightly younger than that, but from pretty much the same location. The cultural products of these cultures are quite different. For example, the characteristic cultural product from the Yangshao culture is this. Beautifully painted potteries in huge size. Some of them are quite big, 3 feet tall, 2 feet wide, that kind of a jar. They are painted pottery, so they use pottery, and that is their major living kind of utensils, and they are beautifully painted with patterns, something we might call it abstract, and there were also more kind of lifelike figurative depiction on those painted pottery as well. And the Longshan culture produce those kind of so-called black pottery. They are not necessarily black, they are just not painted. They came in the natural color of the clay after burning. High temperature produce dark, black, shining surfaces. Lower temperature create the more kind of a brownish color, but they were collectively referred to as black pottery. They were not complicated in terms of the 2-dimensional patterns, but they were more complicated in terms of the 3-dimensional shapes. So they are more kind of sculptural compared to Yangshao culture. And these are from the middle and lower Yellow River. Hongshan culture, in Hongshan culture, not many potteries were discovered. Rather, they created some very interesting stone carving. And those stone are beautiful stone that the Chinese collectively referred to as jade. So these beautiful stones were carved into zoomorphic shapes. Something looks like an animal and sometimes looks like a human figure. And those animal motifs, sometimes they look like a natural animal, a cicada, a turtle or something. But sometimes they are kind of looks more like a mythical figure. And like this one looks like something like a snake, but if you look at the head, there's a mane, and there's a snout and the big eye. So it's kind of a mythological animal figure, some kind of creature, probably not existed in nature, but they produce a lot of stone artifacts. So is the Liangzhu culture in the south. So they produce a lot of jade objects, and their interest is quite different from the Hongshan culture. The Hongshan culture produce a lot of figurative sculptural work. Liangzhu culture created a lot of kind of abstract geometric stone jade carving, something like this, a tube inside a cube, or a circular disc. So they are quite geometric. And anyway, when we look at the Neolithic culture, by looking at their cultural product, we already notice they are quite diversified. They are quite different. They are different cultures. And they also established quite stable conventions. They produce kind of very, they had a kind of very stable cultural product, and they had their own characters. So let's first look at a village, a settlement from the Yangshao culture. This is from a little village called Jiangzhai, and it is from Yangshao culture. It's from Shanxi province in western central China. So from this place, we find a architectural site that is clearly delineated and very well defined. For example, the village had a boundary. The boundary was created by a river, or a ditch, which is diverted from a river that created a border for the village. And secondly, the buildings were all organized into different groups. So it was not just a bunch of buildings thrown upon one another. Rather, we have big houses, we have small houses, and they were grouped into different clusters. So there are 5 groups. And each one with one big building surrounded by many smaller buildings. So there's a big building, and then surrounded by smaller buildings. In general, the big building is built in square shape, and smaller buildings are in circular shape. And they are kind of surrounding a central ground. an open ground. So there's a clearly there is some kind of a spatial organization. Archaeologists also discovered that border also created a border between life and death, the realm of the living and the realm of the dead, because these little line, these are tombs, and they concentrated in this excavated area that is outside the ditch. So these are tombs, and this is the living area. So we don't know, this is prehistory. There was no written record. The only available data are from the archaeological site. So we have no idea exactly what these houses are for, whether this is for the chief, the leader of the community, or whether this is kind of the bedroom for the family head, whether those smaller houses belong to different family, or that is, someone has multiple wives and they have different space for themselves. We don't know. We don't have these kind of detailed answer, but we do know there was a spatial consciousness that was built into this physical world, and that was a community. That was a separation from human society, from the wild nature. That's the kind of first effort in the creation of a human community. This kind of villages had been discovered all over the Yangshao cultural regions in the areas I delineated in the previous map. So this one is from the Banpo village. It has very similar formation. It was from about 3000 BCE. So we find those establishment of borders and big houses, smaller houses. So these archaeological sites are usually only partially excavated because, other areas it's not excavated yet due to different reasons. But just from that little corner from the Banpo village, we can notice kind of some similar features as the previous Jiangzhai village, which is excavated more completely. Now let's take a look into this individual building. So this is what the archaeological site actually look like. So basically you have a bunch of pits and a bunch of holes in the ground. And those beautifully painted potteries were discovered in these sites, right? But based on these remains, archaeologists were able to reconstruct, drawings like that, as you have read in your article, how that well was reconstructed. So when there is a hole, we know there once stand a wooden pile, a wooden pole. And so based on archaeological remains, it is safe to say that people living in Banpo village from the Yangshao culture use a technique of wattle and daup. And this is an architectural term. Wattle and daup refer to a Neolithic technology of construction using wooden branches to create the skeleton of the wall and roof, to create the framework, and then use clay to fill in the space of that framework to create a wall or a roof. So basically, you have those wooden branches to create a woven framework, and then clays were used, wet clays were used to fill in between to create insulation and privacy. And after they dry, they became kind of solid and protective, right? So that kind of technique, it's known as wattle and daup. So this shows you the actual site and what the archaeologists were able to reconstruct based on the traces left in the layers of dirt. Now, that reconstruction looks remarkably similar to classical Chinese architecture that would come, after many thousand years. Like, this is the oldest extant wooden structure in China, the main hall of the Buddhist monastery of Nanchangsu, from the year 781, from the 8th century. So the looks remarkably similar. In terms of the roof style, both of them have a gable, and both of them have those hipped roof, and both of them use wooden framework and then fill in with either clay or with bricks and rammed earth to fill in the blanks. The major difference, of course, is that in the Banpo house, in this specific Banpo house, the roof is directly supported by the ground. There's no actual wall. So this sloping part of the roof rises directly from the ground. And the Buddhist hall has a wall and is elevated on a platform. That's a major difference. So what does this comparison tell us? Does it mean that there is a huge continuity from Neolithic age to the historic age? Possibly. It is possible there is a continuity. Another possibility, of course, if we stay kind of more critical, is probably whoever is the archaeologist reconstructing this drawing, he or she might be influenced by the image of this much later historic examples. So it could be idealized. So the fact is, yes, there are holes here, and that means they have wooden poles to support a ridge. And then we have holes in the ground like that to indicate some kind of roof structure or walled structure. But exactly how these holes come to this image there's still a lot of uncertainty. So I think it's a two-round connection. On one hand, later development of Chinese architecture continued from those Neolithic examples. On the other hand, the reconstructed images was somehow, in one way or another, to different degrees, kind of influenced by our current understanding of traditional Chinese architecture. So history, to some extent, is also, written according to the current reality. So it's all reconstructed. Our, all history is based on the time when that history is being written, and new archaeological discovery will rewrite the past constantly. So I think we should remain critical when we are reading these. We should ask us how close those reconstructed past is to the actual reality of the past. So walls were developed gradually from those kind of pit, from the roof directly supported by ground. In that one was from the early Yangshao age, from about 5000 BCE, but from around 4000 BCE, like the middle Yangshao period, we find those walls start to be constructed. There's clearly a separation of roof from the wall. We have these walls rising from the ground. And also in the previous one, one have to go down to go to the living floor because the roof was so low. And in middle Yangshao period, the ground was not sunken into the ground anymore. So it's no longer subterranean. It is almost equal and slightly higher than the natural ground. So we see that kind of the idea of building a wall and separating the roof from the wall came slightly later in comparison to those early pit or semi-subterranean buildings. And with that, with the creation of walls, there was also interior division. So in late Yangshao, so these are all from the middle and western, the middle Yellow River area in North China. So this one is from Dahe village, from Zhengzhou in Henan province. And this late Yangshao period, from around 3500 BCE, this house, there's not only walls, but also the walls are not only used to support the roof, but also used to divide the interior space into different rooms. So there's kind of a more sophisticated interior division, and that interior division indicate more complicated living style, more specialized space dedicated for more kind of a specific function. Exactly what they are, we don't know. Is it a division of gender, or is it a division of storage from the living space or ritual space from the routine daily living? We are not quite sure, but we do know there is a spatial consciousness developing in terms of the domestic realm in the residential housing. In terms of technique, it's still pretty much wattle and daub. So we have these kind of clay walls with holes inside, and those holes are, of course, used to be the place of those wooden poles. So while interior being divided, there is also greater variation in terms of house size. And we saw that in the early example of Jiangzhai, that big house surrounded by smaller houses. And those big houses came in the square shape, are sometimes divided into smaller spaces as well. And some scholars believe these big houses are the house of the chieftain. And some scholars believe these were community house. These are like the community center used for more public religious activities. So we don't know exactly what is the function of these big house, what is its relationship with the smaller house surrounding it. But we do find that it in this case, for example, it was divided into an area closer to the entrance and then an area in the rear opposite the entrance. And in the rear, the space were divided into smaller 3 rooms, and there is a bigger space adjacent to the entrance, which means the smaller house in the back might be used for more private purposes, and that area is more for public affair. Even if this is a house for the chieftain, you know, it is almost safe to say the back smaller rooms were sleeping chambers and frontal rooms were more for public affair or more ritualistic function. So those are the residential architecture. Now let's take a brief look at the residential, at the religious architecture. So the previous one, most of them, you know, maybe not 100%, but most of them were for life, for dwelling, for physical need. All the following ones are mostly for, say, afterlife, for worshiping, for spiritual need. Something might be defined as religious. The first is a tomb. So this one is from the early Yangshao period. That is from about 5,000 BCE to 4,000 BCE. The tomb is interesting in a few ways. First, it has a orientation that fit into the later Chinese convention. Traditional Chinese architecture like to have a kind of a south-facing orientation. So this tomb, this arrow indicates north. So the tomb master's head is pointing south, quite accurately. And secondly, it is interesting because of the images created by some seashells. So this is a tomb master. He is accompanied by a tiger on the west side and a dragon on the east side. And these patterns were all made of shell. And Henan province is a inland province. It's not a coastal province. So these shells were brought from very far away region, from the seashore, and were used as currency in Henan province, in these inland areas. So these are basically money, right? So this guy has a lot of money, and he used them to create this kind of mythical figures. It is interesting because even today, the symbolic animal of West is called a white tiger, and the symbolic animal of the East is called the blue dragon. So it is remarkable to see that such kind of a symbolism regarding the cardinal directions existed from that early a time. Whether it is a coincidence or it indicated the continuity of these time-honored cultural beliefs, I think it is the later. I think it is unlikely to be a coincidence. It also seems like that there are human sacrifice, because it is possible that the rest of these skeletons were sacrificed to accompany their master. And one of them, which is female, a very young female, has the face down. And then on the east side is a young boy facing up. And there's another kind of skeletons in the northern area. So it seems like there's a consciousness of space, west, east, south, north, and there are sacrificed slaves or servants, and then there's a master who had a lot of money. So this kind of symbolism can be discerned from those religious architecture, like the tombs. That is a tomb for a rich guy, a rich and a powerful guy. Commoners had tombs much more simplistic. They don't have a lot of money to accompany them, but they do have ceramic potteries. So this is a more common tomb. From eastern part of the Yellow River area, we have this kind of a simple pit. The pit is much smaller, and there was no human sacrifice, just the skeleton of the tomb master. And then on the outer layer of the pit, there are broken ceramic potteries, and those are possibly what he used during his lifetime. And then after he died, they were buried to accompany him. So this is like a commoner's tomb. And that is definitely a tomb of someone of status. So tombs, there are also the so-called altars. Again, we are not 100% sure what the function of something like this is, but looks like they are for religious purposes. This one is from Liangzhu culture, from the south, right? From Liangzhu culture. And from about 3300 to BCE to 2250 BCE. The reason why archaeologists believe it is an altar, because it has no practical, it seems like it has no practical function other than a concentric rings of elevated platforms, right? So there is a central platform covered with red dirt, surrounded by a lower platform, and there is also a stone wall surrounding it. And then there are also burials. So there were tombs nearby it. So a educated guess would be this is a combination of ancestral worship with some kind of a sacrificial function. Some kind of sacrifice would be performed on the platform in honor of their deceased ancestor, and that is what we consider kind of religious. Right? So it's a stone and a masonry work. It's very different from the Yellow River architectural conventions, and it has this kind of a stone construction. That is from here. Now, I'm going to show you very quickly the artifacts discovered here from this Liangzhu culture, and not pottery, but something like this, right? Jade objects. These were what discovered in the tombs and altars from the Liangzhu culture. There is a so-called B, which is basically a jade disc. There's a so-called, just to show you how sophisticated the culture is. This is another artifact from Liangzhu culture. There's a carving on this axe. This is the axe. And that carving is quite sophisticated, showing a humanoid figure wearing a feathered headdress, riding some kind of a beast with two bulging eyes and a wide mouth. So there's clearly a human figure here. And this is another, if we zoom into it, you will be amazed by the detail. Right? So human figure, so seems like his arms are tattooed and he's holding the animal or riding the animal. It's quite a hard task to carve something so small and so detailed on a very hard stone. So these are sophisticated cultures. These are Neolithic, but by no means crude. They are quite complicated and something we simply don't understand. But there were a lot of things going on, 5,000 years ago in China. And there's also the so-called Cong. And as I mentioned, Liangzhu culture is more geometric. So it has the central cylinder within a cube. And again, we find the similar image like the previous X. So this image looks very similar to that. You see the same kind of bulging eye and the same smaller face, which might be a simplified human figure. And this is the simplified beast being ridden by that human figure. So exactly what they mean, there are many of them had been discovered. There were thousands of them preserved in museum, and they show great cultural consistency, right here. This is another one. What exactly they mean, we don't know. Some scholars believe they represent religious power, economic power, and military power. This is used for, X was used for execution, and this is used as a symbol for connecting heaven and earth. Circle representing heaven and square representing earth. So this is some kind of supernatural power making connection between heaven and earth, and thus representing religious power. And this is in the shape of the money, and it is the representing economic power. But of course, all these are based on the much later cultural conventions. So exactly what they mean 5,000 years ago, we are not sure at all. They also created, I apologize for going beyond the time, but I would just give me 3 more minutes. Let's just complete this lecture. So they also have this kind of a very finely carved animal figures. So the last one is the, from the north, from this area. So we looked at architectural examples from this area here. And now let's look at one example from Hongshan culture. As I mentioned, this is in Manchurian northeastern area. So here, archaeologists believe they discovered the goddess temple. The reason why they thought it's a goddess temple because they discover a sculpture, a humanoid face, and also some remains of hand at a location, which might be interpreted as a cross. So this is, many thousand years before Christianity. but the building indicates some kind of cross shape. Right? There's a main central space, longer arm. There's a short cross, and the sculpture of the so-called goddess is discovered in the crossing area. So this building, only the footprint is preserved. So there was likely a roof on top of it. Showed some new features in the architectural consciousness. First, there's some kind of axiality. Right? This cross shape create an axis, and there's a symmetry. And if the entrance is from the end, then there is also a spatial organization that was designed to regulate the movement of human being within the space. This is from a Northeastern culture that we don't know much, but we know it is very different from the Yellow River because their cultural products were also mainly jade figures, and they are different from the Liangzhu culture in that their jade sculptures are mostly zoomorphic, mostly animal figures like this an owl. And this would be known as the cloud pattern. And they also produced this kind of famous pig dragon figure. Hundreds of them had been discovered that looks like a pig's snout, and then in combination with a snake-like body that the Chinese would prefer to call it a dragon. And they also has holes indicating they might be fixed or hang from somewhere. They were discovered in large quantity, the same basic design, but came in different variety of proportions and shapes, right? So thank you so much for your patience. And since we already passed the time,